All right, so welcome everyone. My name is Max Meyers. I'm the founder of Nor Cal Aquaponics here in Northern California. And I'm really excited to have so many of you here with us today. There's almost 500 people signed up for the webinar this afternoon. I just wanted to really quickly go over a little about myself and then a little about the webinar, and then we'll get started. I've had a lifelong experience with fish. Ever since I was a baby, I've been raising fish. As a matter of fact, before I could walk, my father was teaching me how to raise goldfish. And I've always had a lifelong love affair with both fish and plants. And in 1997, when I was in my motorcycle accident, as many of you probably saw in the magazine video, my life drastically changed. And it was during that time when I was recovering in the hospital that I fell in love with the science, really, of permaculture. And we're going to talk a little bit more about permaculture in a moment here. And then through my work in permaculture, that led me through various sustainable water systems to the world of aquaponics. So my passion has become how to fuse those two sciences together. You have permaculture on one side and aquaponics on another. Now often I'll see where aquaponics is doing a really good job of integrating an aquaponics system into a permaculture design. But what I wanted to do was kind of combine the science of permaculture with the science of aquaponics to create a new version of aquaponics that was more integrated into how the aquaponics system is designed, maintained, and run itself. So that's where my passion lied in creating what I called closed-loop aquaponics. So that's a little bit about the history. We could go into that more another time, but I want to go right on into the slideshow here. Now, like I said, we're not going to go, there is an introduction webinar, the Introduction to Aquaponics webinar that we've done several times in the past and we'll also make available here in the future. So for those of you that don't have a basic understanding, I'll just give you a quick description now, and then we're going to go into more of the specifics on how the sciences of aquaponics and permaculture get fused together to create a more regenerative or more holistic approach to aquaponics. Basically, aquaponics is the fusion of aquaculture, or the culturing of fish or aquatic organisms, with a combination integrating that with hydroponics. Now hydroponics is farming without soil, or a system of farming with in the water without soil or in a soilless medium. So when you combine aquaponics with hydroponics, when you combine aquaculture with hydroponics, you end up with a system where the waste is generated by the fish themselves, and then the plants readily take up that waste, cleaning the water in the process, and the clean water returns to the fish. So it's this beautiful symbiotic relationship between the fish and the plants. So the plants provide for the fish's needs, and the fish provide for the plant's needs. Now this all happens through magic relationships in the water itself, through the biology and the living organisms in the water, which break down the fish waste and the ammonia in the water and turn it into nitrates that the plants can readily use and take up. All right, so that's enough about the basics. Let's talk about how we can change basic aquaponics into a system that's more sustainable, more regenerative, more holistic, and follows successful examples that we find in nature all around us. So the regenerative sciences that are most in harmony with nature are much more than simply the latest and greatest product, material, or idea. They are holistic approaches to system design, implementation, success, and evolution. And what I mean by that is, it's, in the field of aquaponics, I always talk to colleagues and students and people that are really excited about the latest and greatest idea, whether it's a wood gasifier like you see here on the left, or a rocket mass heater like you see here on the right. Oh man, I'm going to put a rocket mass heater into my aquaponics system, and that's going to be great, and that's it. That's as far as they go. Well, that is a wonderful element, a rocket mass heater, but if you look at it through a permaculture lens, we start to think about, well, how does this element relate to other elements in the system? How can we best connect this element to serve more than one function in our system? How can we choose the proper element in relationship to other elements, such as what types of plants go with what types of fish? Or what are the needs of the greenhouse and how can I meet those through the use of other elements? It's that integration of these elements. And this is what we call whole systems design. So rocket stoves, animals, plants, organisms, etc. can be thought of as elements in a system. Natural systems are rarely, if ever, simply random assemblages of elements. They follow patterns, form layers, create relationships, cultivate succession, and give birth to ecological communities. And here's a great example. This is a food forest, and it's showing the 7 layers of a food forest. And you can see how they all serve a function and occupy different, what we call ecological niches in the landscape. For example, you can see number 5 there, which is the rhizosphere or the root zone, and it obviously takes up space in the soil itself, below the soil surface. Or you could look at number 7, which is the vertical layer, the climbers, the vines. This is using vertical space, and it's not taking up any space on the ground. However, it does need something to climb up, and in this case, it's climbing up the existing tree, which is forming the larger canopy. So you can see how these different elements within the system are laid out in such a way that they don't crowd each other, and in fact, better than that, they support each other. And a great example of that is the one I just gave, how the tree provides the vertical lattice or support structure for the climbing vines and melons and different things that we might have climb up that tree. So fire is a great example. This element can restore forests as well as destroy them, right? So simply having an element in the system isn't a holistic view, or isn't really a whole systems thinking way of integrating that element into the system. You have to understand that fire can be, in this example, fire can be both beneficial or destructive. It's all about how you integrate that into your system. So let's look at how that looks in an aquaponic system. So one of the first questions I like to start with is a tree just a tree? Often in my permaculture classes, we asked our students this exact question. And we put up a piece of empty paper or maybe a whiteboard, and we just ask people, how many functions can you list off that a tree serves? And people will say things like, well, if a tree builds soil through the leaves that fall on the soil, the surface of the forest floor. Or trees provide habitat for animals like birds and squirrels. Or trees filter the air by sequestering carbon and bringing pollution into its tissue, which the tree often sees as a nutrient source, and then letting out clean, filtered, oxygen-rich air. These are just a few. On these lists, the highest I believe we've got is up in the 30s or 40s, and that's just scratching the surface of how many functions and services one tree performs in the system. It's an interconnected organism in a living forest community. It's providing a host. It's a host for all kinds of organisms, whether they're fungus or bacteria, whether they're in the soil, below the soil, above the soil, top of the tree. It's providing so many functions and services in the system. So then what exactly is permaculture? Well, permaculture comes from the 2 root words, permanent and culture. So it's basically a whole systems design science, and its intention is to use nature as a model to best design and create holistic regenerative systems that are interconnected, modeled after nature, and provide for the needs of both the humans and the earth alike in the most regenerative ways possible. And it follows some very important ethics. The ethics of permaculture is what sets it out apart from a lot of other sciences out there. So the core ethics of permaculture are care of the earth, care of the people, fair shares, and which is also can be talked about as returning the surplus or reinvesting the surplus, and of course setting realistic limits to growth and consumption. So these are some of the core ethics of permaculture. So what are some of the principles of permaculture? Now you can see on the bottom right there's a wonderful diagram showing the 12 key principles of permaculture. And we don't have time to go into all of those, but you can see that all of these principles are discovered through our exploration in nature, our observation, our interaction with the natural world, and taking the best examples of how Mother Nature provides for all of its needs and integrating that into our own principles that govern the way we move forward in the permaculture design world. So for example, it always starts with observation. You can see number 1 there is observe and interact. I often like to say there are 3 main rules in real estate. Which are those rules? Everybody always knows. The governing rules are location, location, location. Well, I'd love for you guys to think about permaculture's three most important rules or principles would be observation, observation, observation. So it all starts with observing the system, observing nature, observing the site, observing the culture. This is where we can make some of our best design decisions. So for those of you wanting to learn more about permaculture, there are two resources I highly recommend. As a beginning, as just kind of an introduction or a beginning to the permaculture philosophy, Permaculture in a Nutshell by Patrick Whitfield is an excellent resource, and that can be found at almost any bookstore and on Amazon. And then Gaia's Garden, which is the #1 selling permaculture book in the world that I was invited to be featured in its second edition. And that's an incredible resource. I really recommend that for those wanting kind of a deeper immersion into the permaculture science. So those are some great resources to move further into permaculture design. But let's talk a little bit about elements and the importance of having every element in the system serve more than one function. Now here's a great example. This is a natural wood-fired oven. This is called a cob oven, and it's also a cob bench. And cob is a natural building material. It's made from a mixture of straw, clay, sand, and water. When you mix these together, it makes an adobe-like material that you can build with, and this has been used for thousands of years around the world. So you can see here, what I like to talk about is how many functions this one element, which is basically an oven, serve. So we won't go through all of these functions right now, but to give you an idea, I like to make fun of myself often and say, well, I'm oversleeping some day and some of our interns are working away and they're early in the morning and it's cold out, so they light a fire in the bear head you see there on the left, the cob oven. So they light that fire and they're getting themselves warm, and as they're warming themselves, that stove is serving one function, right? It's warming them. And they're warming it up to cook the morning biscuits and bread, so now it's serving two functions. It's cooking food. And then inside of that oven, I have 100 feet of copper pipe coiled up in there, so as the oven heats, it also heats the water. So as to the right of the oven there, you can see there's a little cove there. And in that cove, we can get hot water to make tea or coffee. So now it's served three functions. And then you see there's a little glass square box there. That's actually an old used toaster oven that I took apart. And I wrapped some copper pipe around that. Now that hot water moves through that copper pipe and heats up that old toaster oven. So now if that person's sitting there and say, man, Max sure is lazy, he's still not awake. Man, I'm getting hungry. I'm not only cold, but I'm getting hungry. I've had my coffee, but man, I sure could use something to eat. So luckily they have some leftover food from the night before. They just put their leftovers there in the oven, and now they warmed up their leftovers. That's four functions. And they're saying, boy, it sure is cold here this morning. So they have a seat in that small little seat there to the right. And under that seat, right below their butt, is a coil of copper tubing coming from the oven, and it's warming their butt. And they're saying, oh man, this is nice. This is comfortable. Now it's serving 5 functions. And then behind it there, you can see there is a nice green, lush, purple-flowered plant there, pink-flowered plant. And that's actually a hibiscus. And it doesn't start to germinate very early in the cold, early spring here. So we actually have some pipe going through the soil there that heats up the soil and gets it going a little earlier so that the plant can get bigger and more established. So it's serving yet another function, 6 functions. And from there it goes to the spiral recycled newspaper bathrooms that you see back there. There's some showers back there that are in a spiral. And they can go, the interns will go back there and they'll take their morning shower and they'll have that water heated from the cob oven itself as they're making the bread and making coffee and heating up leftovers and warming the garden bed and warming their buns, literally their buns. So it's serving 7 functions, 6 functions right there, and it goes on and on and on. Actually, this oven ends up serving 11 functions before it's all said and done. So what is the limit to how many functions one element can serve? There is no limit. The limit is within the mind of the designer, as we like to say, how well your system is designed and how best to integrate it into your system so that it co-supports other elements of your system and serves multiple functions. So using detailed design processes, we begin with dreams, desires, and goals. This is how we come up with a good permaculture design, and this is how I design all my aquaponics systems as well. Next, conduct a thorough analysis and assessment of the site, the culture, climate, ecology, sun, wind, shade, drainage, existing vegetation, etc. This process is always rooted in observation. As I said before, it's very important to observe. How are you going to know where the winter winds come from unless you're there to observe the winds in the winter? How are you going to know the part of the property that gets the hottest? Where are you going to know the noise pollution comes from, or runoff from a neighboring farm, or runoff from a street nearby? You need to know where these are in order to best design your system to use those as a resource, or to design your system that becomes the most appealing to the owner or the person, or meets the overall goals of the project, as well as interconnects those goals with the system itself. This all starts with observation. Now, there's very important strategies called permaculture zones and zonation, as well as permaculture sector and sector analysis. And using these techniques, we can come up with very, very good designs that integrate many of the energies as they move through the site or the system. So, what are some of the tools we need to use in order to make these good designs and good decisions in the process as we design our aquaponics systems? Well, using a permaculture mindset or a permaculture lens, we use things like the niche analysis tool, often referred to by us permaculture designers as the permaculture chicken. Here you can see I've kind of replaced the chicken with a fish, but the idea is the same. For every element in the system, whether that element is a plant, whether that element is a rocket stove, whether that element is a greenhouse, a human, or a fish, it's best to look at the needs, the products, behaviors, and the intrinsic characteristics of each, or intrinsic value of each of these elements. So for example, let's take the fish. If we look at the fish, we need to say, okay, well, what are the fish's needs? The fish needs clean water, it needs air or oxygenation of the water, it needs food, it needs other fish, etc., etc. What are some of the products? Fish can put out meat, other fish waste in the form of fish manure. What are some of its behaviors? It swims, often swims against current. Does it hang out at the surface of the water? Does it hang out at the bottom of the water? Does it use all of the water profile? These are all behaviors. And then what about intrinsic characteristics? What are its growth rates, its type and breed, its color, its tolerance, breed-specific behavior? These are some intrinsic characteristics. So once we best know those about the fish, then we can best match them to the rest of the system or the rest of the aquaponics system design. So of course, if we do that for the fish in the system, then we also want to do that for the plants. One great example for this is I was invited to do an aquaponics design for a system in Africa. Now, often people say, Max, why do you focus so much on the culture of a people? Because it's really important to understand the culture of a people. When I was in Africa, when I was working on it, irresponsible of me to say, all right, I'm going to grow salmon and kale in Africa. Why would that be a poor choice? Well, for two main reasons. Number one, salmon and kale need cold water or a cool, somewhat sheltered climate. So it would be very, very energy intensive to try to grow salmon and kale. The second reason is you're imposing your will not only on the landscape, that's imposing your will on the landscape, trying to make a system that would normally grow a warm species of fish and a warm weather species of plant, trying to get them to grow in that climate would be imposing our will on nature. Well, imposing the will on the culture would be like, oh, well, you African people are used to eating tilapia, catfish, and okra, but I'm going to impose and say you need to eat salmon and kale. So it's much better to take the cultural considerations into your permaculture design so that you can come up with connections that work best, co-support each other, and are more sustainable and better, and ultimately will be successful. So let's talk about how some of the factors of the site can be used to our advantage. So this is just one example of many. So if we look at the way wind pushes on a tree, people are like, well, why does that matter? Well, it matters for a lot of reasons. One, we can use trees and the way we plant them around the site to create microclimates, to create sun traps and heat traps, to keep cold winds off of the site. We can also use sun to shade the site or cool the site. We can also use trees that have strong aromatic smells to them to deter insects from the site. So we can also, if we look at the way, if we have wind being exerted against trees, we can use the movement of the tree to our advantage. For example, we could hook a cable to the top of that tree with a pulley at the bottom, and then every time that tree is blown in the wind, it would move that cable back and forth, and we could literally use that wind force to pump water from one aquaponic system to another, or to refill a source of water that we use to top up our aquaponic system, etc., etc. These are all important factors to consider. Here's a great example of some play pumps, using those observations to do useful work for you in the system. If you're in an area that has a lot of children playing and you need some work to be done, why not turn that playful activity of the children into useful work? So all over the world we've been seeing these examples, and I've built several of these myself. I had a permaculture client several years back, and they had 2 children, and they wanted the children to have a lot of areas to play in the landscape, but they also wanted to grow the maximum amount of food. So we built one of these, and as the children played on the seesaw and teeter-tottered back and forth, they would pump water out of the well that they were playing on top of and fill up a rainwater tank, a storage water tank, on top of the house, and it would gravity feed down and irrigate the plants below. So a great example of how to turn a child's play into useful work. So what are the patterns and flows in nature? What are the patterns and flows of the site and the landscape? What are the patterns and flows in the aquaponic system? So by mimicking the natural flows, or as one of my favorite permaculture teachers likes to say, the sexy curves of nature, then we can come up with more dynamic shapes. We can create more surface area. We can create more diversities of crops and opportunities to grow those crops. We can create different microclimates within the systems themselves. And is this a new idea? Is this something we have to reinvent the wheel? No, we can take the lessons from our ancestors. So aquaponics isn't a new idea. Some consider the Aztec chinampas to be the first examples of aquaponics. Others refer to ancient Egypt. Either way, it's clear that aquaponics has ancient roots. Integrating vegetable growing and fish farming polyculture systems have long been used in far eastern countries such as China and Thailand, where farm wastes are commonly added to feed fish. Ponds and fish are often cultured in flooded rice paddies. So we can take these examples from our ancestors and build on them using modern strategies and modern tools, and create aquaponic systems that are even more sustainable. So centuries of living in harmony with the land, culture, and ecology. This one I love. This is the way they farm on the water in Bangladesh. We've gone to Burma and areas near Bangladesh to learn from these indigenous farmers who've been doing this for a long time. And I love this because when you're ready to take your crop out to the field, you simply use it like a boat. You go out, you row out to your field, so to speak, which is really on the lake. And then when you're ready to harvest, you pull up the little bamboo poles that hold it down to the bottom of the lake. You pull up your poles, and you simply row your boat full of vegetables back into the shore where you harvest. Now that's permaculture. By the way, when you're done, you simply turn the raft into compost for building soil on the banks where the soil is desperately needed. Most of the times, these are done in water because there is no good soil to farm on. So this way you can build soil and use the flooded landscape at the same time. Here's a great example of an aquaponics system we built in Santa Cruz, California, 2012, and we were one of the first people to play with the idea of a bamboo raft, floating the vegetables on bamboo. And this works really great, and when you're done you can simply compost the material. But often the trade-off is with sustainable systems is that they don't last as long. So within 2 years it starts to break and split, and it doesn't really float very well and will need to be composted. So often the trade-off is more sustainable equals a little bit more maintenance or attention paid to the system. But it can absolutely be done. We've built rafts from a variety of materials, and to learn more about that, I highly encourage you guys to check out one of our trainings where we go into detail on raft alternatives for growing aquaponically on the water. So now that we understand some basics, let's use an example of an aquaponics greenhouse. What if we use permaculture design to maximize the diversity, connections, beneficial elements, and functions in that greenhouse? So a very different greenhouse begins to emerge. Here's a great illustration of the famous ark that was created by Dr. John Todd and the people at the New Alchemy Institute and the Ocean Arcs Institute on the East Coast near Chesapeake Bay. They did some amazing work in the 60s, 70s, and 80s using the earth to shelter these and keep these greenhouses from getting too hot in the summer by the natural cooling of the earth, or keeping them from getting too cold in the winter by the natural warming of the earth. These greenhouses were almost completely self-sufficient, only needing a supplemental heat source from animals integrated into the greenhouse or on the back side of the greenhouse, or using some waste wood products or some small twigs as a way of heating it. These were incredibly efficient and self-regenerating and self-sustaining systems. So they've been around for a long time. But let's look at some of these ideas in more of a modern lens. So once again, using that niche analysis and assessment model that we talked about earlier, we can integrate elements into the aquaponics system. Utilizing these principles, we can meet the needs of the system while providing surplus food, products, and resources. Through regenerative design, we match functions to actions and behaviors to services for added crop success, health, diversity, and productivity, while reducing outside inputs, energy, labor, and time. So these are some great images. The bottom one is a classic permaculture system where there is a rotating chicken forage area, and the chicken house is integrated directly into the back side of the greenhouse. Now, if you look at that image on the bottom, you can see that the chickens they're nesting directly below the grow beds in the greenhouse. So all this waste heat is transferred from the chicken house into the greenhouse, and literally the chickens are heating the greenhouse for you. Now, if you do the calculations, which we have figured out, you can calculate how many animals it takes for how many square feet of greenhouse or cubic feet of greenhouse space, and you can literally have snow on the outside of your greenhouse while it's 75 degrees inside your greenhouse without one drop of heating fuel or firewood, just using the waste heat from the animals. Now that, my friends, is a permaculture model. Not only that, but what about the matching? Once again, how many functions can you get out of each element, and how can the different elements co-support each other? So on this top left image, you can see that it's not just the heat that leaves the chicken coop and warms the greenhouse, but it's also the gas exchange between them. So the CO2-rich air from the chickens exhaling goes into the greenhouse, and the plants readily take that up. As a matter of fact, it encourages the plants to grow faster and healthier. And then they let out oxygen-rich air, which is nice and clean, and that clean oxygen-rich air is transferred back into the chicken coop, which creates a nice, clean, odor-free environment for the chickens. So this is a great combination and a way to interconnect both chickens and your aquaponic greenhouse together, and this is a project that we're working on here at Nor Cal Aquaponics. So all life begins with water, so we need to talk a little bit about water. How do you meet the water needs of your aquaponics system? Even though aquaponics uses between 70 and 95% less water than farming in most conventional soil systems, you still need to accommodate for that water that's going to be needed to top up your systems as some water does eventually evaporate. So there's a lot of ways that we can do that, but my favorite is to, of course, use free water from the sky. So rainwater harvesting systems are really important and can be put together quite easily. Now you can see the image on the right, there's a traditional rainwater harvesting system off of a roof into a tank, but right below that is what's called a water pillow or a water bladder. And I really like using these in a lot of my systems because they're so small and they take up very little space. I often integrate these underneath an aquaponics system if it's built on a deck or underneath a house or underneath a shed. And in the case of our greenhouse, this is located underneath our solar panels. And the solar panels are located on the front of the greenhouse. So as the water runs off the greenhouse, it's captured and goes into the water pillow directly under the solar panels. And additionally, that water pillow stays relatively cool. So I can pull air off the bottom of that water pillow with a pipe buried in a trench, And now I have cool air that I can cool my greenhouse in the summer without any air conditioning. That's another great benefit. Talk about stacking functions. There you go. And then what about the top left image? Well, this isn't a new idea. It's just using modern technology to achieve an ancient practice. So this is the idea of harvesting moisture directly out of the air, which the ancient Egyptians did and several cultures have done for thousands of years. But using things like efficient electricity and stainless steel condensers, we can condense that water out of the air for very little energy and recapture it and bring it back into the aquaponic system. So this is an excellent way to reduce the evaporation inside a greenhouse, recapture it, and then reintroduce it into your aquaponic system. Here's some great examples of some of the water from air that's been done around the world. These are some ancient Egyptian models and the more modern one. And you guys can do some more research on Google. Just look up atmospheric water harvester or an ancient atmospheric water harvester, and you'll get some of these examples from our ancestors. So the founder of Permaculture Design is Bill Mollison. Actually, Bill Mollison and David Holmgren co-founded the Permaculture Science. And here's the world-famous Tagari Farm example, and that is Bill Mollison's farm in Australia. And you can see the design is on the top right, and the actual physical reality is on the bottom right. So you can see how he used the design to map out the landscape and harvest as much energy in the system as possible. So as water moves through the system in the form of energy, how do you slow it down? How do you spread it throughout the landscape? How do you sink it into the landscape? And how do you store it? The 4 S's of water in permaculture are slow it, spread it, sink it, and store it. Right? And so you can see in nature, it's very common. In nature, it's very common to that trees and other organisms harvest the water directly out of the air anyhow. Whether it's an insect or a tree or a plant, they use these small little needles and large surface areas to capture the moisture out of the air. You'll often see this in the morning in the form of dew on your lawn or your plants. So this is another thing we can model, and it's a way we can use plants in the landscape to recycle water throughout the landscape. And then fog harvesting. Fog harvesting has been used for thousands of years, and in the modern day it's used a lot in the Chilean mountains, the mountains of Chile, where very little water falls, but there's often mist. So what they do is they set up these long screens or mesh netting, and they put collection troughs or pipes below them, and as it moves through this netting, all those fine particles of moisture in the air accumulate on the net. This is mimicking the needles of a tree, right, or the moss or lichen that grows on a tree. And then once it accumulates, it slowly percolates or drips down until it's captured in the drain trough or pipe below, and then routed to a tank or to the landscape. A great example of a fog harvester. So one reason aquaponics is so water efficient is because fish don't drink. Look at the amount of water it takes to produce beef. That's for the production of the grain, the energy required, the drinking of the animal, all of that. But remember, fish don't drink. So that's another overlooked advantage of aquaponics. So just a little humor in there for you guys. But so to produce the maximum amount of food with the minimum amount of water, energy, space, and time, we can use heat, mechanical force, electricity, and more. So now energy is not even needed in aquaponics, guys. We could build an aquaponics system without any electricity at all. However, when we use electricity, we can get 10 times, I've heard as much as 30 times the production. So obviously, if we can use electricity under renewable means, then using electricity or some form of energy, like the windmills you see on the top, the windmills could be used without electricity directly to drive water pumps, directly to drive air pumps. Of course, this is very site-specific, but on windy sites, this could be a really good option. So obviously, if we're going to provide energy to the system through a permaculture lens and modeling after nature, we want to do these in ways that are as renewable as possible. And there's an image there on the bottom of what we call a thermal electric generator, where we can burn junk mail and twigs and leaves and create electricity in the process. So we can literally heat our greenhouse in an aquaponics system while creating electricity. Pretty amazing. Influencing microclimates using insulation, passive solar, earth tubes, compost heat, and renewable sources. So here's some great examples how we can benefit from Mother Nature again and work with Mother Nature instead of against her. So on the left side down there at the bottom, it's a great image of what I call an earth tube, where literally air is drawn through large tubes that are buried down in the ground, and the natural cooling effect of the air, the natural cooling effect of the earth cools these pipes, and as warm air is drawn through these pipes, it's cooled, and cool air can be drawn into your greenhouse, your home, your office, or any structure that you want to cool. Now, if it's 20 degrees outside in the winter, like a lot of my friends are experiencing in the East Coast of the United States right now, then you can also draw warm air from down below the earth where it's 50 or 55 degrees. Now, that doesn't sound warm, but it sure is a lot warmer than 20 degrees. And then you could have that air go to your boiler or your heating system for your home, and it's preheating that air, and it's allowing the whole heating system of your structure to work a lot more efficiently. And of course, using things like passive solar design, which I'm a huge fan of and we use here at Nor Cal Aquaponics. You can see at the top right there, these are some great examples of passive solar homes and greenhouses. And they make great use of the sun in the wintertime. So in the wintertime, the sun can come into these buildings and heat the greenhouse, whereas in the summertime, when the sun's directly overhead, it's partially shaded by the overhang of the building, and not as much sun comes in, and the greenhouse doesn't just bake all summer long. So this is another great basic example of passive solar design. You guys can also research that on your own and see some other examples. And then, of course, the top left is your kind of your standard solar water heater. But we're going to go into some examples like much better for aquaponics in a moment. But what about compost heat? This is something that I've become really passionate about and have been experimenting with for several years. How can we use the thermophilic processes of composting, the heat generated through the compost process, how can we use that heat to heat our greenhouse or to heat our homes? Now that top right picture is a great example. That is called a complue, a compost heated igloo. And as you can see, they're filling different sections with compost, and they can always have one section that's fresh, another section that's a little older, and another section ready to harvest. So by rotating through, they can maintain temperature in the complue throughout the winter time, and it can be completely heated with no outside energy, simply from the compost process. Additionally, you can have pipes go through this compost. You can heat water. You can heat air. And the beauty is, when you're all done with zero pollution and zero energy needed, you have this incredible compost that you can use to build up your soil as a beautiful compost tea, to fight insects in your garden with your starting mix for your young plants. There's a ton of uses for compost. So this is a great design. And then on the bottom right, you can see on the back side of a greenhouse, this is a system we use quite often. We create a coil of air tubing, and we draw cool air in from the greenhouse. We build a compost pile over that tubing. It's heated by the compost, and then the warm air goes back into the greenhouse. And this can easily be controlled with a thermostat. Some great examples of solar heated air. Now I can't tell you guys how few people I see taking advantage of this basic, very cheap, very easy to do process. This is using Mother Nature's gift to us, the sun. I mean, it's the one thing is not going to run out very soon, guys, is the sun. It'll be around hopefully for billions of years. And in the meantime, we could be using that solar energy in the form of heat and heat the air. So the air being drawn out of our greenhouse, or like you can see in the bottom left image here, it could be drawn out of our homes as well. So you draw that cool air out of the home or the greenhouse in the bottom. As it works its way through these glass-covered air heaters, the air is heated by the sun, and then that hot air, through the normal raising of air through the processes of heat rises, right, guys? So that warm air now goes into the building or greenhouse, and you've heated your greenhouse for zero cost, zero pollution, and zero outside sources of energy. Wonderful example. So some good examples of some earth-sheltered designs. Now I talked about this a little bit more when we mentioned John Todd's greenhouse earlier in the presentation. Here's some great examples of how we can use natural materials like cob, as I mentioned before, the sand, straw, and clay. The greenhouse on the top left is made from cob, and that acts as an incredible insulation and keeps that heat in there throughout the winter. And then of course the top right and the one on the right, actually all the other three images, are examples of earth sheltered. We can bury our greenhouses or our homes, partially bury them. Of course you have the side that faces the sun exposed and not buried so that the sun can come in, but the rest of it is generally buried in the earth so that the earth can keep it warm in the winter and keep it cool in the summer. This is a classic design for the earth ships that I'm sure you've heard so much about. So we can use this design in our greenhouses and in our aquaponics systems as well. So what about building our systems? We can build our systems. We don't have to just use all brand new plastic and stainless steel and fiberglass, guys. We can use recycled and waste and used materials, like the great example of the aquaponics system on the top right. Look at that. They're floating their plants on an old door. Or the bottom, that's an example of our old farm in Costa Rica. And I wasn't able to get newspaper, and I learned a lot about a material called papercrete, but there was no newspaper in town. So I looked around and I saw there was a huge waste product in town from the rice industry, rice hulls. So I took those rice hulls and we just basically invented a new material. We just experimented. We didn't know anything about it, and we came up with something that I call hullcrete. It's a type of fibercrete, and you can see a great example there of a system that we built using 1/4 the amount of concrete that would normally be needed. And then after a hard day's work, of course, all good aquaponic designers should relax. So there's a great example of our intern there relaxing while he gets his toes nibbled on and gets a free pedicure from our tilapia. All right, so natural building techniques. Let's talk a little bit more about some natural building techniques. Of course, many of you have probably heard about straw bales. Straw bales are an excellent way to insulate a building, not just a home though, a greenhouse as well. And we've already spoken about cob, and there's a great example there of a cob greenhouse on the top and on the right. But what about zero waste construction techniques? Here's something that's really big in Latin America and India, using plastic bottles that would normally be thrown away or recycled. These bottles, when they're recycled, by the way, require more energy in the recycling process than is saved in pollution. Not only energy, but waste streams and on and on. We could go on into that at a different time. But here's a great way to use those waste products. You take those bottles and you go around your neighborhood, or you inspire children, you do different projects to clean up the neighborhood, like they've done here on the bottom. They take all that garbage and they smash it into these plastic bottles until it's filled tight with old unrecyclable plastic, like an old potato chip bag or a cell phone package. You cut it up and you put it into one of those bottles, and now you embed those bottles in the walls, and they take up a lot of the space that would normally be concrete, drastically reducing the need of concrete, and you have this incredible water tank that's well insulated and strong and a very, very affordable way to construct. It's a fraction of the cost it would be for a concrete block. And these have been used now for years and years, and people often say, well, what about the leaching of the plastic? There's been tests on these waters, there's no leaching, the bottles are locked deep inside, they're not exposed to the outside elements, and it's a great way to turn a waste product, which was a classic of permaculture, turn a waste product into a resource. So that's something I'm real passionate about. This year we're working on building a aquaponics system with recycled bottles that we've started to accumulate through zero waste programs that we do here and with other organizations. So we call it the eco brick or the bottle brick, and some great examples. Look how beautiful it can be, by the way. You can literally build anything with recycled bottles, whether they're plastic or glass. So this is something I want to encourage people to experiment more with aquaponics. But aquaponics is very, very flexible. We can do a lot of things with aquaponics. We could build a system as small as a desktop, or as large as a massive, 222-acre farm like the aquaponics system I created in Costa Rica. But we can also create mobile and portable systems. Check these greenhouses out. You could have mobile greenhouses on the back of a truck, or an entire trailer being hauled by a big rig. These could go around and be the new taco trucks of the future. Clean, green, organic food delivered to the workplace, to the, to the school. This could be an amazing mobile cafeteria. It could be a mobile education system. There's so many possibilities when you go mobile with aquaponics. Now, if you really want to start to integrate some permaculture aspects into this, how about we look at something like powering that truck with used vegetable oil from the vegetables that you're growing and other vegetables in the community or from other farms, and then using the waste heat as you drive down the road, the heat emanating off of the exhaust pipes, not putting the exhaust pipe directly into the greenhouse, of course, but getting the heat radiating off of the exhaust pipes, we can heat the greenhouses as we're driving down the road. How about that for an idea? Now that's, once again, using waste as a resource. Well, what about, so we've talked about water, and we've talked about electricity, and we've talked about the different needs of the system, but one need we really got to talk about is, what about the nutrients, the fish feed? We can provide nearly all the needs of the fish or the needs of the plants within the system itself if we design it well. Here's a great example of the aquaponics system that we designed and built in Nicaragua. So the top three images are of what's called a soldier fly larva harvester, a fly larva harvester. And basically we're just taking farm waste and putting it into an old barrel. And then we create an escape place for the larva to escape out of there when they mature. So if you look at that center top photo, you can see there is a spiraling tube with some little slits cut in it. And when the larvae are mature, they will climb out that tube, and in the top left image there, you can see they fall into a 5-gallon bucket with a lid on it, where we collect them and feed them to the fish. And you can see an example of some of the fly larvae on the top right there. And in the middle, we've stacked functions. So the middle left image is of a windbreak that we planted around the aquaponics system in Nicaragua. And that windbreak is not just serving the function of blocking the wind and sheltering and protecting the plants, but it's also providing beneficial insect habitat. Pollinators and bees and different beneficial insects that we want to bring and call into the garden are attracted to these shrubs. And also, they're small trees. We can keep them cut and maintained as a nice hedge or a nice windbreak. And then, of course, these trees, they're called moringa, are the highest protein leaf that we currently know about. Not only is it high in protein, but it's also very high in vitamins and minerals. So we literally harvest this, maintain it, keep it at a nice shape to create microclimate, and then all of that material that we cut off of the shrubs, off of the hedge, we dry it out and we make fish feed out of it. You can see in the center there I have a bug zapper. What I like to do is I like to hang my bug zappers directly above my fish tanks. You'd be blown away how this basic strategy, how useful it is and how much you can provide food to your fish. I call it free food from the sky. So if you put one of these bug zappers on a timer, then every day when the sun goes down, the bug zapper will go on, and pretty soon your fish will be trained, and they'll know that the look of that bug zapper means a free meal is coming, and they all kind of jockey for position to get to the top of the water, and they eat the insects directly as they fall to the water, and it's like the fish are waiting with their mouths open for a free meal. It's an excellent, wonderful way to provide free, nutritious, calcium, nutrient-rich insects to your fish. Then on the bottom right, on the middle right there, we have some beautiful ground cover. This is a perennial peanut. It's a great crop to stabilize the slope there. We have zero runoff, zero erosion. It minimizes evaporation in the soil, and of course, it provides an edible leaf that we can feed to the fish as well. And then on the bottom there, you can see the bottom left. There's two local Nicaraguan guys there holding up something that's very important. I asked them, hey, can you guys find out from your grandfathers or uncles or fathers or somebody in the community, what do people normally feed their cattle rather than just going out and buying feed for the cattle? What are the native crops that they feed their cattle? And they discovered that there was a tree there called guasimo. It's a tree that produces a highly nutritious, high protein, high calorie seed pod, and we harvest those seed pods and we mix them in with our fish feed, and it's proven to be a very, very good source of protein for our fish. And then, of course, we raise guppies and minnows and pollywogs, and the waste from the fish that we eat, we save all of that and we make fish meal out of that, and we use that as our own fish food. So then you can see on the bottom right there, that is our finished fish food. We have fed up to 1,000 fish at a time there for several years, going on 3 years, with zero commercially bought food. It's amazing, and that's the final process. We put it in a solar dehydrator, and we dry the food out before we feed it to the fish. So here's another image of that exact same system. It kind of shows you how it's an interconnected system. It's an interconnected outdoor classroom. So you can see here in the background we're using solar hot water to heat the water. In the cool season there, the water can often get down into the high 60s, and we want it up in the high 70s to maximize plant and fish growth. You can see that there's a greenhouse located right there where we need the new young plants to be transferred into the system. You can see there's a solar dehydrator and a worm bin. The worm bin is excellent. It's one of the hearts of all of my aquaponic systems. I take all the waste from the system, any leftover fish skeletons or diseased fish, and of course all the agricultural waste, any broken leaves or diseased leaves, or of course the root systems and the leftover soil plugs, and they all go to the worms. And the worms break it down, and they of course make more worms. They breed incredibly fast, so all of these extra worms are fed to the fish. They provide a valuable food source. Did you guys know that worms double their population every 6 weeks when they're healthy and happy? It's amazing, amazing. And then you look at some of these images in the foreground here, you can see that that's our grow bed. That's where the plants are literally growing. It's kind of hard to see in this image, but there's lettuce floating on the water there, and below the floating rafts are prawns and guppies and snails, and these species, they breed and reproduce at a really fast rate. So we take all of those extra guppies, snails, and shrimp, and we use those as fish feed, and of course the large prawns we can use as human feed as well, delicious human feed. So here's a great example of a small backyard system here. This is one of my favorite backyard systems here at Nor Cal Aquaponics. We call it AP1, Aquaponics 1. It was the first of 8. But this system's been incredibly successful. We've been running it for 3 years now, and it integrates a lot of these permaculture principles, so I'd love to show you some of these here. So if we look in the background, we can see on the back right there's a tall black tank. Now that tall black tank is harvesting the rainwater off of the roof. It holds nearly 300 gallons, and I have that hooked up to a float valve, and every time the system goes a little low, it simply tops the system up with rainwater. Excellent way to top up the system. Now if you look directly behind me, I'm the gentleman in the wheelchair with the 2 dogs. If you look directly behind me, you can see there's a bamboo pyramid, and it has a row of peppers on the bottom, and the rest of it is all cucumbers. Eventually this grew into a beautiful cascading green pyramid loaded with cucumbers. It was beautiful, and eventually I had to kind of rip a hole in the middle just to be able to get into the fish tank. Now the fish tank is directly below the pyramid. You guys see that? It's buried in the ground. And the reason I did that is I wanted to use Mother Nature's, Mother Earth's ability, the Earth's ability to mitigate changes in temperature. So I actually run rainbow trout in this system. So I want to keep the trout's water from getting too warm in the summer more than anything else. So if you notice there's a square box shape behind me. That is a fish tank, 330 gallons, a square fish tank, buried 4 feet deep in the ground. So this resulted in an excellent ability for the Earth to transfer its cool temperature into the water through the summer and keep the trout from getting too warm. And then if you look at the grow beds to the left and right of me, you'll see that as they stage down from the left to the right, they get lower and lower and lower. And the beds are actually all the same depth. They're just buried in the ground. So I wanted to bury them in the ground as much as possible. And I also wanted to use gravity to allow the water to flow from one grow bed to the next, to the next, to the next, and then back to the fish tank. And this process is constantly happening, repeating over and over. That's why we call aquaponics a recirculating system, because it's always recirculating that water. So the real basics of this system is that it has a fish tank behind me, buried 4 feet in the ground. It has a bamboo pyramid with vertical aquaponics growing over that. Below that is a beautiful old Japanese lamp that I modified and turned into a solar bug zapper. Behind that, you'll see there's two small boxes behind that little the little dog house that I use for a pump house for my super efficient air and water pumps. On either side of that, those little boxes. Those are my worm bins. So I have two worm bins so I can continually produce worms and can continually put waste from the garden into the worm bins, and I move from one to the other so that I can continually produce worms and feed worms to my fish. And then, of course, you can see the plants are floating directly on the water, and there's a black barrel in the back left corner, and that is my biological filter, where we filter out the large particles of uneaten fish food and fish waste. So that's the system in it at its most basic. This system here, as small as it is, believe it or not, it can produce about 150 fish a year, and it can produce about, I believe this one is 125 heads of lettuce every 5 to 6 weeks. So it's a very productive system. And guess how much power it uses, guys? It uses the power of a light bulb, about 55 to 60 watts. Very efficient. So nature is almost never sterile. In permaculture, we look to nature to work with us. We do not go to war with nature. The goal is healthy and beneficial organisms outcompeting, consuming, or challenging your pests, molds, etc. Now this guy here is a great example of what I see all too common in aquaponic greenhouses and greenhouses in general. It's a never-ending battle against the pests and disease. So if you sterilize your greenhouse over and over and over, you're going to be doing this battle for the rest of your life. Instead, I spray compost tea and a diversity of organisms around my greenhouse. Now they get established and colonized, and now whenever a pest or organism or bad mold comes in, it immediately gets gobbled up by the good organisms living in the greenhouse, supplied by the compost tea. So this is a great example of how we can work with nature and with beneficial elements in nature rather than only trying to attempt to treat the symptom, which would be in this case a pest or a disease. So waste is a resource not to be wasted. We've talked about this already, but here's a great image that shows how many wastes are generated on the home or on the home farm or the large-scale farm or the aquaponic system, and we can look at those wastes as a resource. In this case, some waste from the house is being used to create biogas. As that waste rots, it creates a useful gas that can be used for cooking and electricity. It could be used to heat the house, etc. And then after that, the overflow creates a very nutritious slurry, and that slurry can be used to feed animals, to feed the soil. It's very high in nutrients. It can be put back to a native forest, soil restoration, etc. There's so many ways we can reintegrate that waste product and turn it into a resource. So that's another principle I really want to get across to you guys about a permaculture-related aquaponic system. So this is the basic aquaponic cycle. This image is courtesy of Sylvia Bernstein of the Aquaponics source. She created this image. I often joke with her that someday I'm going to create my own. But in any case, this is a great representation of the basic aquaponic cycle. So the fish produce the waste, the microbes break the waste down, the transformed waste into plant nutrients are taken up by the plants, and then the clean water is returned back to the fish. Right? It's basically a three-part cycle. Well, what if we integrate permaculture into aquaponics? What does a permaculture-based aquaponic cycle look like? Well, let me show you. So starts to look very different, doesn't it, guys? So first of all, where's the energy going to come from? The top there, you can see there's solar panels, renewable sources of energy power the system. And then how do we feed the fish? Well, the fish feed can be created by a variety of things, and I've spoken of several of them already. We can raise feeder fish, or fish that breed very fast and tend not to get very large, and we use those as a source for feed. We can capture insects. Now the top left there is where actually animals are put over fish, but that's an advanced strategy, although it can be done. Also, you can put a rabbit cage over a worm bin, and the worms explode in population, and then you can feed those worms to the fish. You can use compost and kitchen waste and farm waste and dry out that waste and mix it into your food blends as well. You can use waste from the system to create biogas and you run a biodigester, like the family there with the baby in their arms. They have their own backyard biodigester where they're breaking down waste from their kitchen and making useful fertilizer and gas for cooking. You can capture You can use waste to make fly larva harvester and capture those fly larvae and use them as a valuable fish food as well. You can see an example of that on the left. Then you start to use things from your worms and your worm bins, and you have resources from your worm bins. You're making worm castings, and there's a great example there on the bottom of some worm compost tea. And there's so many things. There's a myriad of life taking place. You grow and you encourage life in your system. So you're not fighting against snails, and you're not fighting against shrimp and guppies in your system. We have guppies in there, which are like partying in the system, playing the rave and the techno music in the background, partying and celebrating as they eat all these incredible plethora of food that's provided to them in the form of microorganisms in the water and the mosquito larvae. And now we have guppies that are happy and breeding, and we can use those extra guppies to feed to our main fish. We can let snails grow and have the guppies help control the population of the snail, and the extra snails we can grind those up and make fish food. The shrimp waste, the fish waste, it can all be used as fish food. Of course, we can provide the water for our systems using things like rainwater harvesting, and we can even capture things like algae and grow aquatic plants, even mushrooms. All these can be used to feed humans and fish. So this is an interrelated cycle, an interconnected cycle where different components of the system are interrelated and where different needs of the system are met throughout different connections in the system itself, right? So it's the relationship between elements, and it's the connections between elements, and the design and the orientation and relationship between the design and the elements that creates a permaculture-based, more sustainable system. So it's so much more than just throwing the greatest ideas together. It's about how they work together and how to design that into your system. So great examples of permaculture-based regenerative designs become more and more productive over time. They are diverse, healthy, efficient, energy and labor saving, not to mention successful, environmentally restorative, and very fulfilling. So this is one of my all-time favorite images. This is the image from the book that literally changed my life. The book's called Soul Viva by one of my favorite authors, Anna Edie, and it shows how you can integrate animals into not only your greenhouse, but also your living space. If you look at the top right there, there's a living space with the animals below, and it's heating the living space. And then in between the living space and the greenhouse is a water-filled wall. That water wall, which is called a trom wall, is capturing the heat emanating from the animals and allowing that heat to transfer into the water where it's stored, and then in the cold nights it's let out into the greenhouse and the home above. And that keeps the greenhouse and the home warm throughout the entire winter, even in climates where there's extreme snow outside. And look at this vertical system, guys. They have a beautiful aquaponic system there in the greenhouse, and it has the rotating vertical system. That's something I'm very passionate about and hope to build this year here at Nor Cal Aquaponics. So it shows how this interconnected system is about relationships between not only the animals and the plants, but us humans as well as the landscape and the site. So here's a good example of what I like to see. This is a good example of a resource, a wasted resource in our society that I believe we could use a lot more efficiently. Now imagine this is an old abandoned big box store like a Walmart or a Best Buy. Look at this, guys. It's an opportunity. You want to talk about zero farm miles? You want to talk about local food? Why not use that wasted roof space as a way to generate food, grow food? So we can do things like create renewable energy on the roof by installing solar panels and wind turbines. We can put rainwater harvesting systems and store rainwater harvesting on the roof, store rainwater on the roof. And not only that, but we could put pipes and tubing through the greenhouse, through the water, waterproof of course, and then that air from the big box below could be piped through that greenhouse in the winter to be warmed, or through the water in the greenhouse in the summer to be cooled. So this could greatly benefit both the greenhouse on the roof and the business below. And then if you integrate something like a Max Meyers speed bump pump, I call it the Max Speed Bump Pump. It's something that I was inspired by Bill Mollison to design. And then every time somebody drives by, because it's about reading the flows in the landscape and understanding your site. So if we understand that cars drive all the time in the parking lot in front of the building, why not install a speed bump pump where every time somebody drives over a speed bump, it slowly collapses. You could have a metal speed bump, and underneath that is a hose, and every time that hose is pressed down flat by the speed bump, it pumps water from the rainwater harvesting down below up to the roof above, where it refills the aquaponics system. Zero energy needed. The energy in the system from the cars moving do the pumping for us. So here's a great example of the Max Meyers speed bump pump, and every time you drive across this hose, it goes through a one-way valve and it pumps the water up onto the roof. And my offer still stands. Anyone who builds this in their aquaponics system gets free assessment and evaluation and help from me in some of the designing. I really want to see this built. So a flow-through aquaponics system, real briefly. This is an experiment we did in 2011 in Costa Rica, and this, you can see that tiny little red dot there on the map on the left, that's a 5-bedroom house, that red dot. So it gives you an idea of how large this farm really was. And on the right there, that's the rice that we grew, and we had about 128 acres of fish that flowed into 82 acres of rice. And now when I say flow through, I mean the water came onto the property, went down through the various canals, and then flowed off of the property back into the canal. The big benefit of this is that the water that went out of the canal after leaving the rice field we're cleaning up the environment, and we're fertilizing the rice, and the rice required next to no fertilizer with gains in yield and quality of the rice. So it was a great system. Unfortunately, in 2012, just because I get so many questions about this, the farm was sold, so this project is no longer happening. So this is one of my design examples. Now look how different this is than most aquaponics systems you guys see. Now this shows how I'm using a circular site. The idea was, oh, we have this circular site, how can you build an aquaponics system in a circle? And so this is using a lot of the elements I just talked about. I have the fish tank in the center, and that fish tank in the center is buried 6 feet down so that the earth itself can mitigate the changes in water temperature. And in this case, we're raising trout. So we're keeping the trout nice and cool at 6 feet down into the soil. And you can see each one of the grow beds, the circular grow beds where the plants are growing, the concentric rings, they are also buried in the ground on the back sides. So this allows them to be sheltered by the earth as well. This also, there's a protective mound of dirt around the whole back side with some trees planted in it. These are some beautiful fruit trees. And that also protects the site from winds in the winter, and it also traps the heat in there in the winter so that it can warm up the system more quickly and capture more of that sunlight throughout the day. So this is a great example of using a lot of these permaculture principles in an aquaponics system. So this is one of the last slides here, guys, and I want to leave it with this, which is a very famous saying in permaculture, which is, as we say in permaculture, the only limit is in your imagination. So these two examples on the bottom I would like to give. So this bottom one on the bottom right. Now this is an average, beautiful landscaped mall. You know, it's a shopping mall. Now these landscapes are just done for beauty. But imagine if we transformed and retrofit this. Instead of it being koi fish down in there, you can see some red fish below the waterfall. Imagine if we change that out with an edible fish. Now you're producing food in the water. And instead of all these beautiful landscape plants that are there strictly for their ornamental value, what if we grew things like cantaloupes and cucumbers and passion fruit and coconuts and bananas? Now we're growing food as well as creating a beautiful environment for the people to enjoy. And what if where the children are on the bottom right there, what if just behind them there was a place where you could rent a fishing pole and you could catch your own fish, and behind that was a taco bar where you could make fish tacos? Talk about fresh food. Talk about 0 miles from farm to table. And then right there, what about the labor to maintain the system? You got to feed them, you got to care for them, all these fish. What if you put a fish food dispenser where the kids came and they put a quarter in there and they're literally feeding your fish for you and paying for your fish food? Now these are some permaculture ideas of how you can benefit the children by providing some entertainment for them, and you can benefit the farmer by doing some of the labor and providing for some of the costs to maintain the farm. This is a permaculture model. And what about transportation? This is one of my all-time fantasies. Often in our aquaponics courses I end with this slide on the left. So this one is actually a hydroponic interstate designed by someone else. But I take this design and I change it a little bit. I'm inspired by this design, but if I modify it, you could imagine a public transportation system like that monorail, or in this case a bi-rail or a two-rail train up there, and below it is a glass tube. It's kind of hard to see in this image, but that glass tube could be filled with colorful, beautiful fish. And the bottom of that train could also be made glass, so you're encouraging people to ride the train, and the children get on the train with their parents. They say, I want to ride public transportation. And they get on the train and they look down, look, Mommy, look at the fish, oh, so beautiful. And as the train moves down the track, which could easily be solar powered, it's pumping water from the fish down into the landscape below. Now the landscape below could be growing all kinds of food crops. And after it irrigates the food crops, the crop's roots have taken up that nutrient, that dirty water coming from the fish, and is collected down there in little collection pools and ponds. Now these ponds could be beautiful. They could be a living landscape of ornamental koi ponds, or a variety of maybe even a public swimming pool. And then that water, once cleaned, can be pumped back up to the glass channel below the train. And how do they get pumped back up? Well, if you use something like the Max Meyers speed bump pump, then all the cars driving on the highway down below simply pump the water right back up every time they drive over it. And nowadays, with the pavers that like PaveGen, it's a product called PaveGen. Every time you move on the pavement, it creates electricity. So there's many ways we can integrate this and create literally a self-supporting, self-generating aquaponic transportation system. Now, how about that, guys? That's permaculture. So I know this has been a packed, a very information-filled presentation. I know there was a lot of information covered, and I'm really, really honored to share it all with you guys, and I've felt really great. It's such a huge turnout. We've had almost 500 people for this webinar. But I know there was a lot of information covered, and I know I've just touched the very, very tip of the iceberg of just a basic introduction on permaculture-based aquaponics. So if you're interested to learn more about the fusing of the sciences of aquaponics and permaculture, and about commercial aquaponic farming and everything you need to know to create your own commercial aquaponics farm, well, then I highly encourage you guys to catch our next training, which is in Austin, Texas, at Austin Aquaponics. And you can find more information for that course at norcalaquaponics.com, austinaquaponics.com, or livingmandala.com. And there, during this course, it'll be the first ever at Austin Aquaponics, the first commercial training yet, and you're gonna learn from 25 years of experience. John Parr, Rob Nash of Austin Aquaponics, and myself will be there, and we each have our experience and our expertise to lend to this class. So it's going to be a very diverse, very excellent course. Last year we had the same teaching team, and it was our best course yet. So anyone, I would highly encourage you and invite you to join us for this course or any of our other courses. We have a course coming up in May in Willits, California. We have a course coming up in August in Half Moon Bay, California, and we have a course coming up in October in Loomis as well. So Texas and California mostly this year, but we're going to be branching out to other places next year. So thank you again for all your time. Thank you for your interest, and it's been a lot of fun doing this webinar with you guys today. Thanks so much.